It was a cold autumn night in a small New Hampshire town. Richard, a 17-year-old boy, was home alone for the weekend, with his parents away at a conference. Their home, an old 1800s residence, stood grandly on the far edge of town. Though it had never been openly stated, many in town whispered that the house was haunted. Richard, like a good teenager, decided to organize a horror movie marathon, intrigued and thrilled to be alone in such a large and ancient house. As the clock struck midnight, the wind began to whistle through the window cracks, and distant flashes of lightning announced an incoming storm. Richard was watching the third movie when he first heard a squeak. It was a shrill sound, coming from the top floor of the house. Startled, he decided to ignore it. However, the squeak became more persistent. It almost sounded like a desperate cry. Richard couldn't ignore it anymore. Armed with a flashlight, he climbed the stairs towards the sound. The shadows cast by the lightning seemed eerily unsettling. The squeak got louder and guided him to a long closed room, the old library. Richard had never entered that room, it had always remained shut. With a deep breath, he opened the door. The air inside was thick and dusty. The squeak suddenly stopped. Just as he was about to turn back, he heard a whisper. It was a muffled voice, pronouncing his name. Richard. His eyes widened in horror. He felt something move behind him and quickly turned around, illuminating the corner with his flashlight. He saw a dark figure, with red eyes like embers. It was a shadowy entity, its outlines indefinite, seeming composed of a sort of black mist. The figure advanced towards him, its whisper turned into a roar filling the room. Richard ran away from the room, but the figure pursued him. He returned to the living room and picked up the phone, trying to call for help. But the lines were dead, the storm probably damaged the wires. He was left with the phone in his hand, as the entity neared him. He felt a chilling cold sensation, as the room filled with suffocating darkness. Richard realized he couldn't escape, but he wouldn't let this thing take him without a fight. He grabbed an old crucifix that was hanging on the wall, brandished it towards the entity, screaming for it to leave him alone. The entity seemed to suffer at the sight of the crucifix and began to retreat. The fight lasted all night, with Richard battling the entity with everything he had. At dawn, the entity withdrew, and Richard collapsed on the floor, exhausted. When his parents returned home, they found Richard shaken but alive. They decided to call an expert to exorcise the house, and from that day there were no more signs of the entity. Ever since then, every time Richard finds himself home alone, he makes sure to have a crucifix with him. He learned the hard way that legends sometimes hide terrifying truths. After that nightmare, Richard never spoke another word. His life, once filled with teenage laughter and jokes, became as silent as a tomb. Although physically unscathed, something in him had irreparably changed. His parents, desperate, sought help from various specialists. Psychiatrists, psychologists, all were consulted in hopes of understanding what had happened to Richard that night. All medical exams were normal, there was no physical explanation for his mute condition. Psychologists suspected the traumatic experience caused a psychological block, but Richard remained silent, his expression always troubled and lost in the void. Despite the absence of verbal confirmation, many of the professionals observing him wondered if the terrible voices he had described in his story. It was a cold winter evening in Vermont. The air was thick with tension in the old colonial wooden house. Jim is the father of two teenage children, Daniel and Lisa. During the afternoon, while they were playing in the library, they had discovered an old diary that Jim had kept hidden for years. "Father, what is this?" Daniel held out the time-worn diary. Lisa watched with her big, frightened eyes. Jim froze. He knew the moment had come. "It's my diary," he admitted with a trembling voice. "I kept it when I was young, before you were born." "But it talks about demons, Father," Lisa said, her voice full of fear. Demons in this house. Is it true? Jim looked at his children. He saw the fear in their eyes, but he knew he could not lie to them. Yes, he answered slowly. It's true. Then he began to tell the story. He talked about how, when he was their age, he had stayed home alone for a week. He was excited at first, but then strange things started happening. Doors that opened and closed on their own, objects that fell for no apparent reason, and, worst of all, sinister whispers in the darkness of the night. The first time I heard the whispers, I thought it was just my imagination, he narrated. But then they got louder. They said my name. They told me things. Terrible things. Jim told his children how he had sought help, but no one believed him. He had to face the horror alone. He talked about how he had fought against the dark entities, using every kind of holy symbol and prayers he had learned. He had managed to survive, but at a cost. In the end, I managed to drive away the demons, he said. Or at least, I thought so. He looked at his children. I never told you, because I didn't want to scare you. But now that you found the diary, I have to admit the truth. The demons never really left. They stayed here, hidden, silent. Daniel and Lisa looked at each other, scared. Then we have to leave, Daniel said. We can't live in a haunted house. They have stayed here, hidden, silent. Jim continued, waiting for the right time to emerge, I suppose. I should have told you earlier, but I didn't know how. The revelation was like a blow to the heart for Daniel and Lisa. We can't stay here, Daniel said firmly, his expression hard. We have to leave. You're right, Jim replied, looking at them intently. Maybe it's time to look for another place to live. In the following days, the family put the house up for sale. They felt uncomfortable staying there, knowing they could be sharing the residence with unseen entities. When they finally found a buyer, they packed up and moved to a new home in another city, hoping to leave behind the dark past. The new home seemed promising. It was bright and welcoming, a stark contrast to the old dwelling. It felt like a new beginning for them, an opportunity to forget the terror they had experienced. But Jim knew it wasn't over. He still remembered the words the entities had spoken, words he had kept hidden from his children: "We will follow you wherever you go." And so, as the family settled into the new house, Jim looked out the window into the dark night, waiting and fearing that the demons of old would emerge from the shadows. He was ready to protect his family, at any cost. His story, a dark secret he had hoped to bury, was now out in the daylight. He had hoped that moving would protect his children from the terror he had experienced. But inside himself, Jim knew that the real battle had just begun. Sitting on the old leather armchair in the living room, Thomas scrutinized the heavy safe in the corner of the room. His father had told him many times not to touch it, but the curiosity of a 12-year-old is something powerful. And then, he had discovered the combination, his father's birth date, which certainly didn't shine for creativity. With a deep breath, Thomas stood up and approached the safe. The cold metal of the knob echoed as he turned the numbers, and with a click, the safe opened. Inside, enclosed in an old wooden trunk, there was an object wrapped in a piece of cloth. It was an ancient golden statuette, intricate in details, representing a fallen angel. The moment Thomas touched the object, a chilling cold ran down his spine. Darkness seemed to envelop the room, and the quiet house turned into a place of nightmare. Shadows danced on the walls, the sound of footsteps echoed in the corridors, and a sinister whisper filled the air. Thomas understood too late the mistake he had made. When Thomas's father, Andrew, returned home, he immediately realized what had happened. He saw the open safe and the statuette outside its wrapping. Desperate, he called his brother Michael, a devout priest. "I have to confess something," Andrew said to Michael, his voice full of fear. "I found this statuette years ago during a business trip. I knew it was cursed, but it had immense value. I didn't know what to do, so I locked it in a safe, hoping that the curse would remain trapped there. But Thomas opened it. Michael listened in silence. "You shouldn't have kept that thing in the house, Andrew," he finally replied. "But now we have to remedy." That night, Michael prepared for the exorcism. He prayed intensely, asking for the strength to fight the darkness that had invaded the house. He took a silver crucifix and holy water, and started the rite. The battle against the curse was fierce. The shadows whispered dark words, trying to break Michael's concentration. But he remained firm, his faith unshakable. After hours of struggle, at last, a bright light illuminated the room. The golden statuette vibrated intensely, then stopped. The shadows disappeared, the whispers ceased, and a peaceful silence pervaded the house. "It's over," said Michael, tired but relieved. He had managed to free the house from the curse. In the small town of Willow Creek, America, there was a person everyone knew and loved, Mrs. Mildred. Mildred was an old lady who always had a smile on her face, living alone in a house with a beautiful garden full of colorful flowers. She was always willing to help her neighbors, babysit the neighborhood kids, or bake cakes for special occasions. No one would have ever thought that sweet Mrs. Mildred could hide a dark secret. One evening, a man named John, an outsider living on the outskirts of town, didn't return home. His disappearance was only noticed and his boss called the police after John failed to show up to work for several days. The police started a search, but they couldn't find a trace of John. Rumors started to circulate about a possible killer targeting the townspeople. People started to look over their shoulders, to be afraid of going out at night. But no one suspected Mrs. Mildred. One evening, another town resident, a woman named Sarah, disappeared. Again, the police searched to no avail. Fear began to grow, and people started suspecting one another. But no one suspected Mrs. Mildred. One day, a young police officer named David stopped by Mildred's house to ask some questions about Sarah's disappearance. While they sat in Mildred's living room, David noticed a picture of John on the mantel. Surprised, he asked Mildred how she knew John. Mildred replied that she had babysat John when he was a child. Suspicious, David asked for permission to look around. Mildred, ever smiling, consented. David examined the house, noting small details that started to creep into his mind: a man's hat that didn't belong to anyone Mildred knew, a woman's earring under the couch, the same type Sarah always wore. When David approached the basement, he noticed a strange smell. He opened the door and walked downstairs. What he found took his breath away: the bodies of John and Sarah, meticulously preserved and dressed as if they were still alive. David was overwhelmed by the horror of what he had discovered. Slowly, he ascended the basement stairs, his stomach turning. Mildred was sitting in her living room, calm as if nothing had happened. David called for backup, and Mildred was arrested without resistance. The news spread rapidly in the small community of Willow Creek. The townspeople were in disbelief. Sweet Mrs. Mildred, a killer? It couldn't be true. But the evidence was there, hidden in the basement of her cozy home. The police began to dig deeper into Mildred's life. They discovered that she had arrived in Willow Creek nearly 50 years ago, a young widow with a mysterious past. She had never talked about her life before Willow Creek, and no one ever asked her. As days passed, the police began to discover more bodies in Mildred's basement. Some had been there for decades, others were more recent. Each victim had been killed with care, then dressed and preserved as if they were still alive. David, shaken, withdrew from the case. He couldn't stop thinking about Mildred, her kindness, her smile. He couldn't understand how she could be the same person who had committed those terrible murders. Meanwhile, Mildred remained in prison, always smiling, always calm. She never confessed to her crimes, never explained why she had committed them. But every now and then, when she thought she wasn't being watched, her smile faded and her gaze became cold and distant. Investigations conducted after Mildred's arrest revealed a past marked by tragedies. Before moving to Willow Creek, Mildred had been married and had a child. But the little one had died shortly after birth, a devastating blow that Mildred had never managed to overcome. Discovering this, the investigators started asking questions. Could this have been the trigger that turned the kind Mildred into a murderer? Did she want to take revenge on the world for the loss of her child, trying to inflict the same pain she had experienced on others? Despite the investigations, Mildred never said a word. She died without giving answers, leaving behind only questions and horror. But the discovery of her tragic past shed new light on her actions. The residents of Willow Creek began to see her not only as a monster, but also as a woman marked by unbearable loss. Yet, despite understanding Mildred's motivations, there was nothing that could justify her actions. Her crimes remained an indelible stain on the history of Willow Creek, a persistent reminder of the human capacity to transform pain into violence.